Hello, and welcome to this second in the series of tackling procrastination. My name's Gareth. I'm a psychologist working at Flinders University in South Australia, and I I started this series primarily for Flinders students as a resource that they could draw on if procrastination was a problem for them. But I realised that the topic of procrastination is kind of relevant regardless of whether you're in academia or not. So I put these episodes up on YouTube as well, just in case anyone can find some use in them. So in the last video, which I'll link to below, we just looked quickly at a definition of procrastination. This kind of voluntary delay of an intended course of action, even though we know and expect that we'll be worse off for the delay. We looked at a couple of examples of procrastination in the academic setting, so leaving assignments till the last minute, cramming for exams. And then I talked a bit about the series itself. So what are we going to cover in the videos coming up? So if that sounds interesting and you want to kind of catch up on that, please have a look at that episode. But what I want to talk about today, or what I really want to try and answer, is this question of whether or not procrastination is a problem. Now, if you've arrived at this video because you've been struggling with procrastination, then you might think that that's a bit of a strange question. But it's a question worth answering because it could be the case that procrastination is uncomfortable and unpleasant. It's something that we don't like, but it's not necessarily related to any kind of objective poor outcomes. Like, it doesn't have any impact on our academic success, or it doesn't have really any kind of medium to long-term impacts on our health or mental health. In which case this series would be very different. Rather than trying to actually get rid of procrastination, we'd sort of be trying to look at how one would cope with or manage procrastination in the context of their studies more broadly. Now, as a spoiler, if you don't want to hang around to the end of the video, then the answer to this question is essentially, at this stage, yes, that procrastination is a problem because it has measurable negative impacts on things that are important to us, particularly academic outcomes in this setting, but also health and mental health outcomes. But it's worth spending a bit of time just thinking about those negative consequences, really as a form of motivation for, yes, this is worth working on, it's worth me investing my time to try and address or tackle in some way, shape or form. So we'll start with academic impacts. So we go back here to a 2012 study by Richardson, Abraham and Bond. They reviewed 13 years of research. They looked at 241 data sets, and they were interested in what kinds of psychological factors predict a grade point average. And they, from memory, explored over 50 different types of predictors, and procrastination did show up as being related to GPA in a negative way. So the more you procrastinate, the more likely you'll have a lower GPA. Now, they found it to be a relatively small correlation, or a weakish correlation. They found some other factors like self-efficacy and grade goals and effort regulation were actually stronger predictors of GPA. But interestingly, as we move through this series and as we talk more about procrastination, those kinds of topics, self-efficacy and grade goals and effort regulation, will be things that we look at. They seem to sort of form a cluster with procrastination in terms of impacting on a person's academic performance. So that was really kind of the first article I found that hinted at a relationship between procrastination as we understand it in academic performance. Then we fast forward to 2015. Kim and Seo do a similar kind of meta-analysis, big sort of study of multiple studies. They looked at 33 studies in total, consisting of about 38,000 plus participants, and in the process concluded that procrastination is indeed negatively correlated with academic performance, and negatively correlated with academic performance as measured by a number of different methods. So GPA is one, course grades is another, quiz scores, things like that. Now, we'll revisit this study in some future episodes, because there are some other findings that come out of this big review that are relevant to us at other points. But really the conclusion that they drew on the basis of their analysis was that it's still valid to interpret procrastination as something that is problematic, and something that we should be working on and trying to improve. And I'll revisit this idea just at the end of this episode as well. And then since that kind of 2015 study, which was a pretty big one, highly referenced and regularly referenced, we see a kind of a smattering of additional studies finding a similar kind of impact. And this is by no means a comprehensive overview of every study that's been done since then, but this is a selection of articles that have been published since that 2015 review that continue to support this idea of procrastination having negative impacts on academic outcomes. So Gustafsson and Miyake in 2017, they took 177 undergraduate students, and they were trying over a 3 or 4 week period to see whether or not they could improve or reduce those students' procrastination. And they were using a SMART goal setting intervention. Now, they didn't find that their intervention worked, but they did find that a student's procrastination scores at the beginning of that 3 or 4 week period predicted whether or not that student would achieve the goals they'd set for themselves by the end of the intervention period. So then in 2018, we've got Klajic and Gaudreau. They did a prospective study of 208 university students, and they showed a couple of interesting things. So first, they showed that the students who procrastinate or who report high levels of procrastination have overall lower grades, which kind of supports what we've seen already. But then they also found that within an individual student, the topics that they reported procrastinating more in were then the topics that they did worse in. So it starts to show the kind of level of specificity involved here, that procrastination really impacts on the area where it is most prevalent, where it is most severe, where it is most impactful. Right? So a student might have 4 or 5 topics running at any point in time, and they might be doing well with some of those topics, but others they procrastinate more on. The ones that they procrastinate more on are going to be the ones in which they do worse. And then we've got another 2018 study, again another prospective one from some of the same authors. They took 258 students and followed them over time, and again just found that the procrastination negatively predicted their academic achievement. Now the difference with this study, or the addition of this study, was that they controlled for a few things like their academic history and their cognitive ability as measured by working memory, I think it was, and found that the effect of procrastination existed regardless of controlling for that academic ability or that academic history. And then another paper that I like to talk about in this space, we actually head back in time to 1997. So a paper by Tyson Baumeister. They had 44 students in a health psychology course that they followed over the course of the course. And I think they most elegantly summarized the outcomes of their study in their abstract, which I've repeated in full here, but procrastinators reported lower stress and less illness than non-procrastinators early in the semester. So early in the semester, procrastination is kind of this short-term alleviation of stress, but then those students reported higher stress and more illness later in the term, and then overall they were sicker. And then procrastinators also received lower grades on all assignments. So not only did this kind of predict, this study itself kind of kicked off, I guess, this interest in procrastination and academic outcomes, but it also picked up an effect which has also been explored a lot more recently. And that's the idea that procrastination has health impacts in addition to academic impacts. So there's a 2003 study by Sirois, Milia, Gordon and Pitchell. They took 122 students. They did a cross-sectional study, so they're just measuring them essentially at the one time period. They looked at procrastination, what they call trait procrastination. So that's the tendency of a person to procrastinate across multiple aspects of their lives. They measured trait procrastination, they measured health problems, and they found that procrastination did predict health problems. And it seemed to operate by three mechanisms. So procrastination led to higher levels of stress. Procrastination led to fewer wellness behaviors. That's basically like exercising, getting good sleep, eating a good diet. And procrastination also led to treatment delays in seeking out assistance for health issues. So that combination of things led to, or seemed to explain, the poorer health in the higher procrastination students. And then one of the authors followed up that study in 2007 and did it with the general population. So not just students, who tend to be the subject of most of these kinds of studies, but they repeated this study in the general population and found basically the same idea, that trait procrastination did predict health problems, and in this case it seemed to be mediated primarily by stress. And that makes sense. If you think about it, the more things that you put off, the more things that you delay, the more things start to build up. And it might not just be academic issues, it might be things you've got to do around the house, bills you've got to pay, people you've got to call back, emails you've got to answer. And as that load of things that you need to get done builds up, then your stress level increases. And we know that stress in a chronic form is linked to poorer health. So then we move forward again into 2010. Stead, Shanahan and Neufeld took 135 undergrads. They looked at their daily stress levels and their procrastination, and in this case found that it seemed to be related to their mental health. So the studies I just mentioned before were very much physical health oriented. Stead, Shanahan and Neufeld showed that we see the same kind of pattern. The links between stress, procrastination and health, in this case mental health, as we did in the physical health domain. And then a 2013 paper, again a couple of authors you might recommend from previous papers who will pop up again in future episodes because they seem to have done a lot of work in this space. They wrote a really interesting paper in 2013. I do recommend chasing this paper up. I'll try and link to all my references down in the information below. But they wrote a really interesting paper looking at how procrastination is really a short-term mood regulation response. Like we procrastinate in the short term because it makes us feel better. But the procrastination has that short-term focus has significant negative impacts for our future self. So we make things really good for current self, but we make things really hard for our future self. And they reviewed a combination of their studies and other people, and concluded that procrastination was associated with a range of health problems. So poorer mental health, anxiety and depression, stress levels, which we've discussed. Less health protective behaviors, so we're talking here about those kinds of the wellness behaviors I mentioned before, good sleep, good diet, physical activity, and also it seems to be consistently related to being slower to seek healthcare, and this is one of the I guess from my perspective within the university, one of the more distressing things we see in relation to procrastination in students is not only are they struggling with the procrastination side of things, but then they are less likely or slower to reach out for help in the process, which kind of doubles or compounds the impact of what it is they're going through. So all of those studies up until now were essentially conducted on students. So we looked at and measured, or we didn't, the authors did, apologies. They looked at and measured procrastination and health behaviours and stress levels and looked at the relationships between them. But a good study I think is really worth looking into and adding here was a study by Grunschel et al. In 2013. They just asked students flat out. So they took a group of 36 students, some of whom were receiving counselling support in relation to procrastination and other issues, and some who weren't. And they just asked them what were the impacts of their procrastination, what sort of things did it affect in their life. And of the most highly endorsed are the ones that are listed here. So these students said that procrastination had an impact on their affect. So they were, and quite a wide and quite a varied impact on their affect. So anger, anxiety, discomfort, shame, sadness, pressure, remorse. They talked about the impact on their physical and mental state. So they were stressed and they were exhausted. Continued procrastination had an impact on their sense of self. They started to develop a really negative sense of who they were and their capacity. Their procrastination impacted on the course of their studies, so they felt time pressured. They didn't think they were achieving to their best. They didn't feel like they were doing their best quality work. In some cases, they were having to repeat topics or repeat semesters, and they had that constant sense of accumulation of work. It was building up. The more they put it off, the more it built up. And then what we also saw was some kind of spillage into their private life. So maybe because of the repetition or other factors, there are some financial pressures, and the overall stress and workload impacts were impacting the relationships in the home. So I think what you can see, even just from this example, but the ones above, is that there's a consistent and reliable, measurable impact of procrastination on multiple domains of life. And as such, I'd conclude, and I think generally in the literature they would conclude, that procrastination has tangible and significant negative impacts, both academically and personal, and that it is worth addressing and tackling. Now, one thing I want to talk about just briefly, which we may get to address in a future episode, we'll see how it unfolds, but whilst the studies to date do suggest that there is an association between procrastination and negative academic outcomes. And that does seem to hold up in both cross-sectional and prospective studies. So it does appear as though procrastination is at least one of the drivers of these negative outcomes. It's not really clear to me yet how strong an impact that is. So to put that into perspective, see if I've got this. So I wrote a blog post recently, because I blog as part of my job at Flinders, and I looked at a study that was exploring the links between study habits and exam performance. It was a study by Walk, Shannon, Roll and Fry in 2020, and they were looking at the different kind of study habits that students used, and then how that was related to their exam performance. And what they found and what they were able to do in their study is kind of using the regression equations, get some estimates of what the actual measurable impact in performance was based on the kinds of study habits that they were using. So in this case, we don't have to dig in. They were able to see that for certain types of study habits, they were associated with a 2 to 3% increase in performance. So like a 2 to 3% increase in the score on your final exam. That certain habits were actually associated with a greater increase of 4 to 7%. And that a certain behavior, again, if a student was using, in this case, primarily active strategies, they could get up to a 5 to 10% increase in their exam performance as a result. Now, that's not really what I have yet in relation to procrastination. So it's hard at this stage to say definitively what level of impact procrastination is having on academic performance. We're confident that it is. We're confident that it's a reliable impact. But are we talking about a small impact here or a large impact? It's not clear at this stage. But again, that might be something that we can visit and clarify in future episodes. Certainly if some research comes out in the meantime that tries to get a better read on the strength of that connection. Also, just one other thing that I want to talk about before we finish up with this episode. There is a concept in the literature known as active procrastination, as opposed to, or as contrasted to, passive procrastination, which essentially we've been talking about. So essentially there's a subgroup of procrastinators that procrastinate strategically. So they leave work until the last minute because they are aware of their capacity to work under pressure. They prefer to work under pressure. They work better under situations of tight deadlines. They feel more in control when they do that. So there's a group of people whose scores on procrastination instruments can be quite high, but for whom their academic performance is actually quite good, and their mental and physical health is not impaired as a result. Now, the reason is that this group is using procrastination strategically. They're using it to work in a way that's more consistent with their strengths and their personality. So it might be the case that you're looking at this video and that you're thinking you do procrastinate, but you also tend to do quite well. You don't feel as though it's having an impact on your academic performance, in which case that may be a very valid observation. It may not actually necessarily be a problem for you. Now, this is still considered by most to be only a subset of procrastinators, and some people actually don't even consider active procrastination to be a form of procrastination. That it's in reality it's a form of strategic delay. It's not procrastination. It requires that you know that the delay is going to impact negatively on you. So this group that knows it's not going to impact negatively on them, therefore would not reach the original definition. But those kind of theoretical, battles aside, I did just want to address that there is this space in the procrastination literature that looks at it more as a strength, or more as of a strategic capacity that some have to work under pressure. So, thank you for joining me for this particular episode. A very kind of quick but hopefully relatively convincing exploration of some of the impacts of procrastination. In the next episode, we're going to hone in on the question of whether you're a procrastinator or not. So how is it that we self-assess our own procrastination, and how, on the basis of that self-assessment, do we determine whether or not it's a problem for us? Now, in the meantime, before that episode drops, you can really just start thinking about your own procrastination behaviors, and start to ask yourself the question of what, if any, consequences have you experienced as a result. What of what we've talked about today sounded familiar to you? Are there other things that you've experienced as a result of procrastination that weren't really picked up in some of those studies? And just to start thinking about whether or not you really feel as though you would qualify as a procrastinator, and we'll talk about how hard that is to actually define next time. But you'll also start really self-reflecting on what the impacts might be and what you might gain from tackling it, gain from doing these future episodes and actually starting to work on it. So until then, thank you very much for joining me today. I hope you have a great morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are, and I'll see and talk to you soon.